This is the demonstration of the snap array instrument for the adult full mouth series. And we used it for the pedo full mouth, but we're going to demonstrate real quick how to use it for that standard adult full mouth that you've been taking all semester. Okay, so just like before, for the posteriors, you've got the little scissor end, and you can put the size 2 sensor, because we're going to go back to that adult full mouth with the size 2 sensor for the posteriors. So this is the size 2 sensor, and we're going to clip the snap array onto the sensor so that it's right there at the edge. We're going to slide the little slider up to hold it. And you want to make sure that you've got the front part of the sensor lined up on that same wider part of the snap array. You don't want the narrower side because it's just not as stable to bite on. Plus, you want to be able to have it so that the front side of the sensor is facing the same side as that little purple line. And if you'll notice, the purple line is lined up with the edge of the sensor. And that way, even if you can't see the sensor, you know where the front edge of it is when you're putting this into the patient's mouth and setting everything up. Okay, we're going to go ahead and place that into the patient's mouth. This is for maxillary right, mandibular left. And you're going to set this in, and it's the exact same placement that you've been using all semester. You want the distal half of the second premolar for the molar shot, and the distal half of the canine for the premolars. So in this case, if we're lining this up for a molar shot, you want the distal half of the second premolar, and you want that purple line to be, sorry, it looks a little like the Blair Witch Project right here. Cord got tangled up. But you want to line it up. Distal half of the second, that's actually, it looks like the first premolar, distal half of the premolar, so pretend like that's the second premolar, so that that distal edge is in the image, and then your maxillary first molar would also be in the image. Okay, we're going to go ahead now and line up the PID. Just like you did with the pedo full mouth, using this for the posteriors, you're going to look at that handle. That is your vertical angle. It's a maxillary, so it's got a little positive vertical angle. Line that up so that it's even with the line on the PID. Then you want to make sure that the handle of the snap array that's sticking out of the patient's mouth is parallel with the end of your PID. That gives you your horizontal angulation, just like before. Okay, we're going to go ahead and place it into place without messing up either of those angles. And remember, the tongue depressor is going to just kind of extend that PID, so don't make up crazy angles. You want it coming right off the edge. And since this is a maxillary and the sensor is above, you want that snap array just very bottom edge to be covered with the beam, and the front to be covered as well. If you've got the front in front of the purple line and the bottom just below that snap array, then you've got your sensor covered. Okay, now we're going to set it up for posterior. Actually, I think we're going to do the premolar shot, but you just move it up to the canine and get the distal half of the canine in the image for the premolar shot. Okay, for mandibular, it works basically the same. You place it in, distal half of second premolar for the molar shot, distal half of canine for the premolar. I'm going to show you the premolar exposure here. Okay, same thing. There's your vertical angle. It's just a little bit negative. It's almost flat, but it's a little bit negative. Line up the stick with the line on the PID. Okay, now we're setting the horizontal. I want the handle parallel to the end of my PID. And then once I've got my vertical and horizontal angle, I'm going to move the whole tube head without changing the angle into place. Since this is a mandibular, I want the top edge of the PID to be just above, and then the front edge to be just in front of the purple line. So if I'm just above the top of the snap array and just in front of the purple line, I know that I've got the whole sensor in the image. Okay, then you just flip it around. We're going to now take the maxillary, or that's how we were set up before for the mandibular left. Now we're going to take maxillary left by just moving it to the top. You still want the front of that sensor to be with the wider part of the snap array, and the maxillary left, mandibular right is set up the same way. Hi, Miss Coy. Okay, for bite wings, you're going to use those little stick-on tabs just like we used with the pediatric full mouth. You're going to place that in the center, top to bottom. And then you line everything up exactly the same way. So mandibular teeth, distal half of second premolar, distal half of canine, just like you've been taking bite wings the whole semester. For the full mouth on an adult, for the anteriors, we are going to do a little different. On the pedo, we used the size 2 for an occlusal, but that's not how you're going to take an adult full mouth. So this is the size 1 sensor. The smooth side goes against, and then that same slider that held the bottom part together, you're going to slide that up to hold your size 1 sensor in, just like this. Make sure it's good and centered. You're going to place this in. Again, make sure that you know which teeth you're taking an image of. You're going to place this in. You place it firmly against the roof of the mouth and against their bottom teeth or bottom lip for stability. If you had it just kind of floating around in there willy-nilly, they're going to get it off center. It's not going to be where you want it to be. So you've got to really make it stable by putting it on the roof of the mouth and then resting it on the lower lip. You'd have your patient hold it. I'm going to turn this around so you can see better. When you line this up, what you're going to do, I'll zoom it in a little there. All right, so what you're looking for is the incisal edge, and don't go making up angles. Come straight in perpendicular from the incisal edge to the sensor. Okay, so right off the incisal edge and then touching the sensor at a perpendicular angle. That tells you where the incisal edge is actually going to hit on the image. And if you look at it, I'm going to straighten it up. Okay, so when you're looking at that angle, you want that the incisal edge to hit about 3 to 4 millimeters from the bottom edge of the sensor. So you can see the sensor, and you just want to be about 3 to 4 millimeters above, just like that. So 3 to 4 millimeters above the bottom edge of the sensor is where you want your incisal edge to hit when you measure it. Okay, so that's the measurement there, perpendicular to your sensor, to your snap array. Again, you can't make up angles. That's not going to tell you anything. You got to come straight off the incisal edge, perpendicular to the sensor. Normally, you'd have the patient hold this. Unfortunately, for demonstration purposes, our mannequin doesn't have any arms. No, you would never tape this to a patient's face. But it would look something like that, and the patient would just hold that end that was hanging out. Okay, so now we're going to bring the PID over. Okay, use that handle. So we're going to use the handle and put the end of the PID parallel to the snap array handle that's sticking out. So you want the end of the PID to be parallel to your snap array handle. Okay, make sure it's good and centered over that snap array itself. Then you're just going to move it up into position. And again, we're going to come off the bottom edge of the PID just to make sure we're covering the sensor. Okay, so if you can see there, the bottom edge of the PID is coming in just below the bottom edge of the sensor. You don't want it to be too high. That's what the incisal edge looks like. So the incisal edge hits about right there on the sensor. So you've got a good 3 or 4 millimeters. Then we're going to put the PID back in place. And that's the bottom edge of your PID, just below. We're going to lower it just a little bit, but just below the bottom edge of your sensor. Okay, and it looks just like that. You want to make sure everything's good and centered. Make sure everything's good and parallel. it looks just like that. Okay, and then depending on which image you're taking, it would kind of look, you'd start with a canine shot, then move around to the central lateral. Each time you move it, just make sure you're double checking, make sure the incisal edge is where you want it on the sensor, and then you'd line the PID back up and take another image. Okay, now I'm going to show you how to take the mandibular anteriors. You're going to use that little alligator end again, but your sensor is the size 1 sensor. It's standing up vertically, just like that. Cord comes out the top, not the bottom. You'll kind of move it out of the way. The front of my sensor is lined up with the wider part of the snap array, and we're going to place it in whichever image you want. So we'll say this is a midline. You'll put it in, he'll bite together. And then you would line it up basically the same way you did the posteriors. So you're checking to see what your vertical angle is. And right here it's kind of flat. Okay, you want to make sure you're good and parallel. So you're going to make sure that the end of the PID is lined up with the handle. And then you just make sure that the top edge of your PID is covering, just barely, the top edge of your snap array so that you know you have the sensor in the image. Also, again, make sure it's good and centered. And that's it. That's the whole full mouth with the snap array on an adult.